Welcome to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, hosted by me, Zibby Owens. It's an award-winning podcast with over 1,900 episodes, all featuring authors of books you love and those you have yet to discover. Listen daily 5 times a week. Then go to zibbymedia.com and learn more about what the LA Times called the Zibbyverse. Zibby Media includes Zibby's Bookshop, an independent bookstore in Santa Monica, Zibby Books Publishing, Zibby Retreats, Zibby's Book Club, and more. Go check it out at zibbymedia.com and follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens. It'll take you where you need to go. Thanks for listening. Laura Dave is the author of The Night We Lost Him, a novel. This is her second time coming on the podcast. Laura is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Last Thing He Told Me, 800 Grapes, and other novels. Her work has been published in 38 countries. The Last Thing He Told Me has sold 3 million copies and is now a limited series on Apple TV+, which, by the way, I watched and really loved. She resides in Santa Monica, California. Welcome, Laura. Thanks for coming back on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss The Night We Lost Him. Congrats.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I always love seeing you.
Oh, you too. I was so excited to get this book. I was like, oh, yes, Laura Dave. I finally made time and read it. So good. And you're so good. And oh my gosh. Anyway, tell listeners what it's about, please.
Well, the book focuses on the death of a family patriarch, Liam Noone, and he dies when he falls off the cliff near his Carpinteria home. And his children, he has 3 children from his 3 different marriages, 2 of whom are estranged, and they sort of join forces to try to figure out what actually happened to their father and uncover this family secret of about 50 years that sort of changes the dynamic of what they thought they knew about the man they loved.
Amazing. So you have backstories on sort of all of the characters, which are really interesting, including one of the brothers, and he had an old injury and his baseball career is gone. So now you know he's sort of this like frustrated, you had a word for it in quotes. It was so funny, but now I can't remember. Like that he went, I don't know, like a, you know.
That he was seeking, that he's been seeking.
I like that.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So he's like the seeking, trying to find his place in the world. He's estranged from Tommy. And then you have your main character who's this successful architect, but she's kind of like, I'm doing this on my own. And so when you put them all in this conflict and she doesn't even want to know what's in the will, you find a way to like lure her back. Tell me how you get a reader right into it, because you're so good at that.
You know, for me, all of my books, including The Night We Lost Him, really start with a question. And here the question was, what does it mean to be the witness to someone's life? And so I immediately know when I'm writing, I often don't know anything that's going to happen down the line or how I'm going to answer that question. But what always comes to me very strongly is that opening scene, that opening moment in which we're going to ask the narrative question of the book that's going to lead us to that emotional answer. And I just had this idea of these 2 estranged siblings and that she is so accomplished, as you said. And really, she was the child from her father's first marriage before he sort of had the hotel empire success that his later children, that was their reality. And so she's very much, as you said, self-made. And I knew that I wanted her to have chosen to extricate herself. And I imagine this opening scene where the brother knows enough about her to lure her in on her terms. And that's exactly sort of what he does. And they meet under the auspices of her work in a way. I won't ruin the opening scene, but, that is sort of very surprising and gets her on her heels and immediately has her asking some of the questions that he wants to know the answers to as well.
I would also like to know who the influencer is modeled after in the opening pages. Did you have a particular account in mind?
I did not have a particular account in mind for her, but something that really actually influenced Liam Noone and that whole storyline was, I don't know, and if you remember when the Scholastic Succession.
Yes,
drama,
I do remember that. Yes, I do.
And I just like with The Last Thing He Told Me, when Enron sort of had like an inspiration, which is to say, it doesn't necessarily look or feel like that. But when I read that and I read what was going on there, I started to have a concretized answer to what does it mean to be the witness to someone's life based on that. So Liam was sort of the one that came out of real world events a bit. The influencer actually wasn't really based on anybody, except something that was really funny was that I was trying to figure out how to name her. And I had the name Morgan written down. And as a mom yourself, you know that sometimes these manuscript pages make it with you to tennis lessons or baseball practice or whatever. And I was sitting in a sports practice for my son, and there were a bunch of moms and other caretakers around. And I was like, what is a good name for an influencer? And Morgan was currently in the book as Morgan. And obviously there's a gazillion names in the world. And one of my son's friends, caretakers, actually said, what about the name Morgan? It was the first name she said, and it was already in the book.
Oh
but, it just felt like this very weird zeitgeisty moment of, I guess, Morgan. I guess everyone knows an influencer named Morgan somehow.
I can think of an influencer.
But yes, so that was
awesome. Going further into the book, we meet Cece, who runs like a big chain of hotels versus the Noones, who have a smaller thing, and she has these giant thing. Oh my God, I can't even make a sense.
No, that's exactly correct. She's more like a Marriott or a Hilton, these huge, huge hotels. And he's like a luxury boutique hotel magnet. Either can I.
I love living in the world of hotel owners and how they build their competing brands and attempted merger acquisition, perhaps, question mark, or not. So tell me about how you learned about the hotel industry. My secret dream is to own my own hotel one day called the Zibby Hotel and make it all full of books, but we'll see. Anyway, tell me about everything you learned from Hotel World.
I literally, first of all, would be your first guest because that sounds dreamy. And you could also even do like how your wonderful bookstore has, it's divided by themes, like the different rooms could be different themes. Like you could stay in the romance room and all the books in your room are romantic.
Oh, I hadn't thought about it like that.
And
my goodness.
Anyway, I would very much like that hotel. So I did two sort of huge tranches of research for this book. One was around the luxury boutique hotel industry, which for me was lovely because I went to several of them to sort of get a feeling for how you individualize and specify on that level. And something that I learned that was sort of interesting about hotel ownership that I hadn't known going in is quite often like what you think of as the Four Seasons is that's a management company and it's actually owned by somebody else and they sort of manage those hotels, which is, I never thought of it that way. I just always imagined it was that Four Seasons was the owner, but there's so many different rules for how a small hotel is run and what how you make that both feel expansive across a brand, but also individualized. So I spent some time with different people in the hotel industry who were very helpful. And then I took a lot of liberties to make it work for this character. And then I also spent a lot of time with Nora learning about neuroarchitecture. And I spoke with several neuroarchitects. That was something that I didn't know going into this book. When you were mentioning that Nora, the main character, is an architect, I like the idea, and I had heard of this idea that there are some architects who lead not with like structural innovation, but lead with sort of emotional innovation. How is the room going to hold you? How is this place going to add to your life in some way or another? But I didn't know that that was a field of architecture until I was well into the writing of the book. And then a good friend put a movie in front of me called a documentary in front of me called My Architect, which is this wonderful story about a son learning about his father through his father's buildings, a son that didn't really know his father.
Writing it down, going to watch it.
It is so incredible. It is really wonderful. And through him, this is the architect who created the Salk Institute. And when the more I started learning about him, I learned that he was considered to be the founder of neuroarchitecture. And so I sort of by accident backed my way into, this is exactly what I didn't know I wanted. And so for me, writing is often rewriting. And so I sort of reimagined Nora within the field of neuroarchitecture specifically after I spoke with some of these experts.
Interesting. You do a really nice job also of, and I'm sorry, can you hear these lawnmowers or not really? Can you hear?
No, I can't hear them at all.
Oh my God, there's literally like a guy right there. Okay. I'm like literally 3 feet away. You did a really nice job too of tackling like complicated grief and what happens when you lose someone you love, but your relationship obviously has its layers. And how do you
Yes.
process that grief and unexpected grief and all of that? Talk about writing through that, because it very much felt like when I was reading it, like, is Laura grieving? It felt very, very raw.
So I have had quite a journey, and as we all have, especially since COVID, where I think I know that you guys lost someone in your family as well. Like, I think everyone's sort of grief came to the surface, I think, in a very large way. For me specifically, I lost my mom shortly before COVID, and then I lost my father 9 months later. So the truth in the book is the loss of both parents, whom I was incredibly close to, and they are not like the parents in this book. The mom is in that my parents were very happily married, and but the mom was in that, like, spoke to her every day. But I think that with the parents in this book, I liked the idea of thinking about grief in a different way. I had heard this interview shortly actually before I lost my mom, and that really, it was almost like a gift. It was this idea of thinking about grief not as something to be scared of, but it's a visiting. It's almost a reminder that you had this great love and that love does not end. And I thought, just like I don't like to write into violence or into, I don't like to write. I want to find the hope. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to write about grief and think about grief in a way that there's hope within it. And so that's sort of how I came to it.
Interesting. But it's also true how sometimes when another loss happens, like compound grief, that you feel all the feelings again and like more intensified than originally.
I think compound grief is a very real thing that, that could use even more airspace than it gets, because it's almost like you're reopening a primal wound, but you're doing it, a girlfriend of mine talked about it. Like, imagine having 2 babies within a very short period, the impact on your body of those 2 babies. And I think the impact of all that love and all that expression and everything else. And in a very similar way, it's weird to think about birth and death in that way, but extreme feeling in close proximity really can do a number on you. And you have to really rally up from that.
How did you cope with that? Did you have any ways that really helped? Yeah.
I think my family and my son really, more than anything, and writing always for me is a huge source of inspiration. And it's like you become your own counsel because you write your way through something. One of my favorite books is Heartburn by Nora Ephron.
Oh yeah. So great.
I mean, I was going to see if I have it right behind me, but the best present that my husband probably ever gave me, oh, there it is, I'll bring it over, is a first edition of Heartburn signed that he got me one year. I just love that book. But I always liked that when she says at the beginning of that book, she made that book funny, so then you control the story. But I think that the lesson there is in the writing, you can find funny, you can find relief, you can find joy, and you can figure out a way to honor what somebody brought. And in the case of Heartburn, which is a story of her divorce, how to let it go, which I think is really, really powerful to think about.
It is interesting. So you have all these sort of real things that we're all grappling with. And yet the book is really, how did this man die? Right?
Yes.
The mystery and trying to figure that out, and, red herrings and, where is this going? And, I kind of had a different theory, but it's fine. Yeah. I'm like always wrong.
Well, I'm glad you're wrong. I would have been more happy if you were right and you're like, I knew it from page 1, then I hadn't done my job.
That's true. Okay, good. All right. I feel better. Thank you. Did you know all along what the answer, so to speak, would be, or how did you do it?
So within the story, as you're pointing to, there's like a 50-year love story, which is really the father's secret.
Yep.
And writing that love story is one of the most joyful experiences I've had writing in all of my books. I loved imagining this love story over 50 years. So the answer is yes and no. I always knew who the woman was, which is, I purposely, I hope, buried who that woman was until you read it and you're like, oh my God, I can't. And then you get the joy, hopefully, of reading through again and being like, oh, wait, there were the clues and I saw it, but I thought it was this other woman. And in any event, so I knew it was her. And I knew that she was linked to his death, but it was only through the writing that I figured out how she was linked. There were many other iterations in which someone else in her life or someone else in their life was responsible for his death as a result of this love affair. So I like the idea also, I think, of I don't ever like there to be a villain in my stories, rather that everything is, I love the word you just used with compounding, because I think also there's compounding pain and compounding evil and compounding ways that we create injury when we're on the wrong path. And I like the idea that there is no villain here, but the pain around this secret had reverberations, just like anytime we lie or keep secrets, it can have reverberations, which is why it's so freeing when we let that go.
I feel like that is the heart of every single story, is the secret behind it, and like the damage it does when you keep a secret yourself.
Yes, exactly.
That covers most.
I totally agree with you. And I think also what's really interesting is the secrets we keep from ourselves. Because if we know someone else is keeping a secret from us, that is a different kind of pain. But very often it is about unearthing what you don't want yourself to know. Like you hear people often say, I knew my relationship was over, or I knew that this career wasn't working for me, or I knew I had to be brave enough to do X, but they don't know it until they know it. And then they look back and they're like, I knew it, but I didn't have it in me to tell myself that yet. And so I'm really fascinated about how we can help people, the estranged siblings here, really help each other tell themselves the secret, unearth the secret that they weren't willing to say out loud yet.
Yep. And I didn't even mention the chef and the restaurant owner. It's another great thing. I'm like, this is awesome. She's taking me out to eat. I'm getting to go to nice hotels. I get to go to like this beautiful house and multiple houses in California. Like, I'm in. This is great. What a ride.
Well, I did have this feeling when I knew she was going to be an architect. I spent a lot of time at different houses in these places. I'm like, if it's her story and she's an architect, she would be looking at these houses and thinking about them in a way that I might not normally. And I wanted the reader to have a visceral feeling of being places that they don't normally go necessarily. But and the other piece of that with the chef, and that recipe is actually, I make that recipe every Sunday night at our house. We have strawberry pizza on Sunday nights, and we have friends over, and I learned about that recipe from this wonderful chef, Jeremy Fox, who at that point was in Napa Valley. And my husband and I were just dating at that time. And we went to Napa Valley for a weekend or something, and we ate at his restaurant there. And the strawberry pizza was the best thing I ever had in my life. And so I spent years and years trying to recreate it. And then he actually moved to Santa Monica, the chef, and opened several restaurants blocks from where we live. So it felt like he owns Rustic Canyon here. I know you have a place you probably know.
Of course,
he was the chef there, and at Birdie G's, and he's wonderful. So I credit him with that pizza that's brought so much joy around here.
Are you going to do events in those restaurants? You have to.
I should. I mean, I should talk to him about that.
Should. They should be for sale there. So since our last interview, it must have been before your last book came out, but anyway, it became this massive sensation, 3 million copies. That's crazy. Huge movie with Jennifer Garner. So how, if at all, did that change you being able to keep writing and not like getting that in your head? And also just kind of how cool is that?
Well, thank you for that. And I think that it wasn't my first book. Right. So it made it easier. I think about that all the time. I think if it was my first book, I would hope that nothing would change and I would still sit down and write every day. But I don't know if I would have heard too many voices in my head or been I don't know what it would have done. I always think about it that way. It had been my first book. Michael Chabon, who we were just talking about before we started, he wrote this amazing essay called Wrecked, which I highly recommend to any writer. And I can send it to you, Zibby, if you can't find it. But he wrote this amazing essay called Wrecked, in which he talks about The Mysteries of Pittsburgh came out. It was met with success and how hard it was to write his second book after that because of that. And he spent years and years writing the wrong book until he pivoted. I think because The Last Thing He Told Me was actually so hard for me to write. I took 10 years to write it. I put it down 3 different times. I wrote 2 books in the interim. I threw out 70,000 of the 90,000 words I wrote. I realized that every book is just sort of a journey. It was almost like The Last Thing He Told Me was preparing me for The Last Thing He Told Me, for what happened with it. And this book, it wasn't hard. It was no harder, I should say, than any of the others. I'm actually writing a sequel of The Last Thing He Told Me now as well, which will come out next year. And so it's sort of a weird, interesting thing to be revisiting those characters again. And it feels like a nice coming home because I spent so much time with them. But this one was really it was a book I really, really wanted to write. And so I just enjoyed the writing, I mean, talk to me. We're in the middle of writing the movie for it. And for this one, for Netflix, and I'm writing it with my husband again, just like we did with The Last Thing He Told Me. And so maybe in 6 months, I'll tell you something different. I'll be like, maybe these characters, I don't know what I'm going to do. But as of right now, the writing of the actual book was, I mean, I know that, with your writing too, like you probably have the same experience. Like some things are easier than others, like some books. And this was a book. Some books are labors of love. And this book was sort of a love letter. It was a letter I really wanted to write to my parents, really.
Yeah. It's like a nice way to say goodbye.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I'm sorry about the loss of your parents. I'm sorry how close it was. I'm sorry for that pain. And I can just imagine them you're such a warm, like loving person. Just imagine how warm and loving they must have been to create you. Yeah. And so I feel that loss for you. But another fabulous book. That's so cool. It's going to be another Netflix. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
I'm just so excited. It couldn't happen to a nicer person.
Well, that is so nice. And I do feel like it's so funny because we haven't gotten to see each other a lot, but every time I see you, I feel like I've seen you so much because I'm at Zibby's bookstore all the time.
I know you are. Thank you.
I'm there all the time. We took I don't know if I told you this, but your store is so wonderful. And we took my son's went on a class trip because their school's not so far away and your brother's children are at that school.
Yes.
Yes. And when we went, my book was up in the store and my son whispered to me, "Do not say that your book is here." And I was like, I will not say a word. So I didn't say anything. The booksellers knew me because I had been there and they didn't everyone. I was just a mom, doing the field trip. So, but my son loves it. We all just love that store. It's brought so much to the community. So I do feel like I get to see you all the time between that and Instagram, even though I don't get to see you all the time. So it's very lovely.
Well, I love following along your journey as well. And I showed my son your piles. I was like, this is what happens when you're really successful authors. You have to sign all these tip-in sheets before you even have the books come out. He's like, wow, how does she know it's going to sell? And I'm like, she knows.
Oh gosh, I hope so. I'm like knocking on all sorts of things.
Gosh,
I hope so.
Well, come to the store anytime, sign the books. We'd love to have you back. And yeah, I'll be watching and cheering.
Okay, wonderful. It's so great to see you.
Great to see you too. Bye, Laura. Thanks for listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you love it, please leave a review and follow us on social at Zibby Owens and at Zibby Readers.